When AMD launched the Ryzen 7 series back in 2017, they offered desktop computing power never before seen at that price point, with an 8-core 16-thread processor for as little as $329. 3 years later, the same thing is happening to laptops. Introducing the ASUS TUF A15. For just $1,200 you get an 8-core 16-thread AMD Ryzen 7 4800H and an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2060. Is this laptop actually as good as it seems? Or is it too good to be true? Let's see, shall we? So first impressions. With an RGB keyboard, highlighted WASD keys, and a striking design that literally has the word gaming engraved on it, this is, without a doubt, a gaming laptop. But one that's surprisingly sleek, with thin bezels and a reasonably thin chassis considering what this thing packs. It's also not too heavy at around 2.2 kilos. Now, I'm not saying you won't notice it and its hefty 230-watt power adapter in your backpack, but you won't feel exhausted after a day of hauling it around. And haul it around you will, because this is a machine you won't feel embarrassed to whip out in a cafe or classroom. The laptop looks discreet and stealthy with no flashy elements, well, apart from the keyboard lighting that is, but turn that off and you have a pretty normal if slightly futuristic looking laptop with its angular design. The fortress gray aluminum casing adds a welcome touch of elegance, which helps it blend in with the more business-oriented machines. It also feels very premium and well built, almost to the point of being Mac-like. Well, at least at the back. Because every other service will remind you that you are shopping in the more affordable segment of the market, with plastic basically everywhere. The main chassis is covered in this brushed metal, which, spoiler alert, is really just plastic with a brushed texture that feels okay, if a little cheap to touch. Despite the predominantly plastic construction, the build quality is surprisingly good. The chassis is stiff, well, at least as stiff as plastic can be. There's not much flex at the keyboard deck and the screen, and thanks to the military-grade durability rating, you can be sure this laptop will survive harsh environments reasonably well. It's also easy to upgrade. Just remove 10 screws and loosen one pop-open screw and pull the cover out. And here we have access to 2 M.2 slots and 2 RAM slots. Models with the 48 watt-hour battery also come with a 2.5-inch drive bay, while models with the 90 watt-hour battery don't. Being a gaming laptop, the port selection is excellent with just about everything you'd need, with 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A's, 1 USB 2.0 Type A, 1 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C with DisplayPort 1.4 output, 1 Ethernet, and 1 HDMI 2.0B. I like how almost all the I/O is on the left side, so it won't get in the way of your hand when using a mouse, at least for right-handed people anyway. It would have been nice to see an SD card reader, since some people might want to use this as a content creation machine, and a reader would make it easier to import media from a camera, for example. Thunderbolt 3 would have been nice too, but sadly, no Ryzen laptop out at the time of filming supports it, since it's an Intel standard and they have the final say on what device can use it. You also have an integrated 720p webcam, which looks clear enough for video calls even if it is a little grainy. The mic is also clear and provides enough detail in my voice. My only suggestion to improve this would be the addition of a physical shutter to block the camera, like on the ThinkPad X395 I reviewed before. There seems to be enough room to integrate one into this reverse notch, and it would be way more convenient than using your arts and crafts skills. The reverse notch itself is a design feature I really like and wish more manufacturers used, because unlike the typical flush lid design I see on many other laptops, the reverse notch allows me to open up the laptop with one hand really easily. I can't quite open it all the way because of the hinge tightness and the weight distribution, but I can forgive it for that because of the notch. The keyboard is another strong point. It's comfortable to type on, the keys have a nice weight to them, preventing fatigue over long typing sessions, and they offer plenty of travel at 1.8mm, which makes for a satisfying typing experience. The keyboard has the standard ASUS gaming laptop keyboard layout, but I like the presence of a numpad because some games actually make use of the numpad for controls, like when flying aircraft in GTA 5. I also like how they've highlighted these WASD keys by making them translucent, since you can see the mechanism and the RGB lighting clearly, which is cool. The lighting itself is bright and visible even in the day thanks to the translucent key edges, And although it's only single zone lighting, at least you have the flexibility to choose your own color rather than being stuck with red like on the TUF machines of old. You can choose between 16.7 million colors and several lighting effects within the Armory Crate software, which you can also use to choose between performance profiles and view a variety of diagnostic information. You can also change the keyboard lighting brightness using FN and the up or down arrow key, which is convenient. The trackpad was nice to use as well. It's a good size with enough room to move my fingers around while not being too large where it gets in the way of your palms. It tracked accurately and consistently without any skips, gestures were easy to make, and the surface was smooth enough to glide your finger across even when sweaty. The trackpad uses dedicated hardware buttons, which I actually prefer to integrated buttons since sometimes the cursor moves ever so slightly when I click. The buttons themselves don't require much force and they feel and sound really satisfying to press. Now let's move on to the screen. My unit sports a matte 1080p 144Hz IPS display from Panda. And it's not amazing, but it's far from the worst display I've seen. 1080p at 15.6 inches is very sharp on this display at 141 ppi, and you won't be able to distinguish individual pixels from the normal viewing distance of around 2 feet away. The 144Hz refresh rate makes everything feel so fluid and smooth, which is great for high refresh rate games and even just general Windows usage. The display supports FreeSync to reduce screen tearing, which worked well even below 60 FPS, and being an IPS panel, you can expect good viewing angles with minimal color shift. However, it doesn't get too bright, maxing out at just 250 nits, which might make it a little difficult to use outdoors. But the color gamut is where it gets real bad. It's a 6-bit panel with 2-bit FRC that somehow only covers 66% of the sRGB color space. Yikes. As a result, colors are a little flat and not very vibrant. Here's a comparison showing the same background on my Y720 screen, which has 100% sRGB coverage, and the A15s with only 66. And there's a clear difference in color saturation here. But it doesn't stop there. This panel's response time is way slower than it should be for its 144Hz refresh rate, with a colossal gray-to-gray response time of 25 milliseconds, which means that moving images on this panel will produce trails. Here's what I mean by that. This is a chasing squares test conducted on the ASUS PG34AQ, a 100Hz IPS monitor with a 5 millisecond gray-to-gray response time. And here's that same test on the A15's panel. Notice how the squares leave a much more noticeable trail on the A15 panel. This shows that the pixels on the A15's panel can't change color as fast as those on the PG34AQ, and therefore the response time of the A15's panel is slower than the PG34AQ. This ghosting isn't a problem in Windows, but it won't be ideal for high refresh rate gameplay. But then again, I'm not sure how many of you would really notice it, because I didn't. And that's coming from someone who regularly plays games on a 100Hz 5 millisecond IPS monitor. Maybe because being a smaller screen, details are harder to notice, but personally I find inverse ghosting a lot more noticeable and annoying, and there was no sign of it on this panel, which is good. The contrast ratio is about 1000 to 1, which is normal for an IPS display, and panel uniformity is excellent with very little backlight bleed or IPS glow, making this display surprisingly good in dark environments, which is rare for an IPS panel. So because of the low sRGB coverage, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole for color-critical work like photo or video editing, but despite the slow response time, I still think it's alright for gaming, and the colors are good enough for watching TV shows or movies. Thankfully, you'll also be able to hear them even with a bit of background noise because these speakers get pretty loud. They're not the loudest I've heard, that award goes to my Lenovo Y720 over there, but these aren't half bad, even if they are downward firing. Although they can sound a bit muffled at times because they are downward firing, they still sound good with noticeable bass, which is nice. Here's what an episode of Community sounds like at 100% volume. Alright, let's sum up what we have so far. On one hand, apart from this aluminum case, the materials used feel a bit cheap and the screen's color gamut and response time are crap. But on the other, The build quality, port selection, and speakers are good, the keyboard and trackpad were nice to use, and the fluidity of 144Hz, even with that slow response time, just makes everything so buttery smooth. Overall, kind of a mixed bag, but perhaps the performance of this machine will change that. Before we get to that though, let's talk specs. The unit I have is equipped with a Ryzen 7 4800H with integrated Vega 7 graphics, a 90W RTX 2060, 16 gigs of DDR4 3200, a 512GB Intel 660p NVMe SSD, dual band AC Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth 5. So first, how does this laptop feel during normal use? Well, it's about as good as it gets, really. It's snappy and responsive, programs and documents open instantly, which is really no surprise considering the hardware this laptop has, and the Wi-Fi was quick and stable as well. Even the SSD, which is an Intel 660p on this model, felt fast. At around 1500 megabytes per second sequential read and 1000 megabytes per second sequential write, it is one of the slower NVMe's given that it uses QLC flash and that it's a 512GB model. Remember that smaller SSDs are slower than their bigger brothers, but you can't really tell different SSDs apart unless you do large file transfers. All of them are going to feel fast. Even a SATA SSD, which is way slower than an NVMe on paper, feels almost identical. That 144Hz refresh rate though, somehow makes this laptop feel faster than a similar system with a 60Hz screen just because of how smooth all the animations and graphics look, so it gives you the illusion that your system is faster than it actually is. Battery life is a bit more complicated as the A15 comes with two battery options, a 48Wh battery and a 90Wh battery. My model is equipped with a 48Wh battery, and battery life was about average for a gaming laptop. I hit around 3 to 4 hours with the power mode at better battery, with a screen at around 80% brightness, which isn't bad considering the specs, but you'll still need to bring along the power adapter if you want all-day usage. If you go for the 90Wh battery though, that's almost double the capacity, so you should get around 7 to 8 hours of usage, which is great for a gaming laptop. Overall, top marks for Windows experience. Now for the part you've all been waiting for, the benchmarks. All these tests were run on turbo mode for maximum cooling and performance. Let's start our first set of tests with PCMark 10, a complete PC benchmarking software that tests your system in a variety of situations. PCMark 10 results are divided into 3 subcategories, and we're comparing this system to the average 4800H and 2060 laptop. Our system is slightly ahead of the average in essentials and productivity by about 1.6 and 7.1% respectively, while being slightly behind in digital content creation by about 9.3%. The overall result puts our laptop about 1% slower than the average 4800H and 2060 laptop, which is within margin of error. The next test we have is 3DMark TimeSpy, a DirectX 12 benchmark that tests the CPU and GPU. Our 4800H is around 7% slower than the average 4800H, which isn't within margin of error, but still very difficult to notice in the real world, while our 2060 is basically identical to the average 2060. The overall score here is more influenced by the GPU result, which gives us an overall rating that's almost identical to the average 4800H and 2060 notebook. It's the same story in 3DMark Firestrike, a DirectX 11 benchmark which sees basically identical scores between the average 4800H 2060 laptop and our system. Now that we know how this laptop performs for its spec, let's see how our CPU performs compared to other models. On Cinebench R15 and R20 single-threaded, we can really see the advantage of the new Zen 2 architecture compared to Zen Plus. The 4800H's single-core speed is 30% faster than last gen's 3750H laptop CPU, which is a monumental gain. It's also noticeably faster than last gen's top-of-the-range desktop chip, the 2700X. What's even more impressive is that the 4800H actually manages to get within spitting distance of the Intel laptop chips, even with their much higher boost clocks. The 9900K and 3700X desktop chips, though, are still faster than the 4800H, but only by around 10%, which isn't much. Where the real magic happens is the multi-threaded test. The 4800H destroys the 3750H, but that is to be expected having twice as many cores and threads. But it manages to beat both 8-core Intel laptop chips and even the 2700X desktop chip, which is fantastic. It's still outperformed by the 3700X and 9900K desktop chips though, but that's understandable because desktop CPUs have higher power limits and can therefore maintain a higher boost clock for longer. And with that, let's see how this 4800H behaves under a sustained load. Here we have hardware info 64 graphing CPU temperature, clock speed, and current TDP with a CPU-Z stress test running in the background. The CPU manages to stay at 4 GHz on all cores at 80 degrees, while our TDP slowly increases until it levels off at 45 watts, where its temperature stabilizes at around 73 degrees, with our CPU maintaining a healthy 3.8 GHz on all cores. Alright, that's enough of the CPU tests. Now let's see how our 2060 performs. This chart shows the 3D Mark Time Spy graphics score of several GPUs. First, let's address one thing. RTX 20 series mobile GPUs are not desktop class like 10 series mobile GPUs were, which is disappointing. There is a significant performance delta between the mobile and desktop versions of the same GPU, where the desktop 2060 and 2070 are around 20% faster than their laptop versions. The mobile 2060 performs similarly to the desktop 1660 Ti, which itself is a good card for high refresh rate 1080p gaming. It's also slightly faster than the mobile 1660 Ti by around 10%. The mobile 2060 is around 11% slower than the 2070 Max-Q and 19% slower than the mobile 2070. We see a similar trend in this Firestrike graphics score comparison, with our mobile 2060 slightly slower than the 2070 Max-Q, slightly faster than the mobile 1660 Ti, and weirdly this time, the desktop 1660 Ti as well. Okay, I think that's enough of the serious benchmarking, and now it's time to actually play some games. Starting with GTA 5. On the upper left-hand corner, you can see the MSI Afterburner overlay with GPU temperature, usage, and clock speed, CPU temperature, usage, and clock speed, and current, average, 1% low, and 0.1% low FPS. Here you see me having a fun day out with the police. This test was run at very high settings, and we averaged 75 FPS with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 44. Though our numbers aren't close to 144 FPS, we average more than 60, and you do notice the extra fluidity. Next up, Modern Warfare. I'm playing a 6v6 match of Hardpoint on Shipment, also known as chaos in its purest form, because you're constantly being bombarded with explosives, flash, stun, and gas grenades. The game was at highest settings with RTX off, and it ran well, averaging 83 FPS with a 1% low of 52 and a 0.1% low of 2. Ignore the 0.1% lows on this chart because they're just stutters that happen during respawns and are not representative of in-game performance. 0.1% low aside, these numbers are great and you'll really be able to take advantage of this display's refresh rate. This game surprisingly still ran well with RTX on. It does run noticeably slower than without RTX, but we still have respectable numbers with a 70 FPS average, a 36 FPS 1% low, and a 2 FPS 0.1% low. If you like playing your games with RTX on, you can definitely get by on Modern Warfare. Honestly though, I can't really tell the difference, so personally I'd leave that off for the extra performance. The next game we have is Apex Legends, which is known for being an optimized game. Here you see me taking on a squad held up in a small building. The game was run at maximum settings at 1080p, and it runs very well. During the entire game, which lasted 18 minutes, we averaged a solid 98 FPS with a 1% low of 71 and a 0.1% low of 63. Finally, we have Monster Hunter World, and here you see me hunting a monster. This was run at high settings at 1080p, and we averaged 67 FPS with a 1% low of 50 and a 0.1% low of 42. Overall, great performance across the board, reaching near 100 FPS in some games while still maintaining at least 60 on the heavier titles, all at high detail or better. And it did so while being quite cool on the outside. The keyboard deck and palm rest never got uncomfortably hot, which makes sense because plastic is an insulator. Unfortunately, temperatures on the inside weren't as good. Here I have hardware info 64 showing CPU temperature, clock, TDP, and GPU temperature, and a CPU-Z stress test and heaven benchmark running in the background simultaneously to stress both the CPU and GPU. GPU thermals were actually okay, maintaining a perfectly reasonable 78 degrees. Our CPU, though, is at a whopping 95 degrees. That's just 10 degrees away from its maximum temperature, which is concerning. But wait a minute, you say. Almost no one will be running their CPU and GPU at full load. Perhaps a game would be more realistic. Well, in Apex Legends, my CPU never exceeded 50% usage, yet here we are with about 90 degree temperatures. How does this happen to a laptop that's not too thin and has 2 fans with 3 exhaust vents? Well, take a look at the bottom panel and you'll find out. What are these? Intakes for ants? The airflow inside the chassis is being choked by these tiny and seemingly random intake vents. This reduces the cooling system's efficiency, and it also means that the fans have to work harder to pull air into the chassis to keep temperatures under control, which makes them run loudly. Take a listen. Though you can easily drown this out with the speakers, it's still concerning that something this loud doesn't run very cool, which is too bad because I've seen some tests where doing something as simple as removing the bottom panel reduces CPU and GPU temperatures by as much as 10 degrees. That does tend to increase the temperatures of other components though, such as the VRMs or SSD, because the intake in its current design forces air to pass through these components, which is probably why ASUS designed the intake in this way. It's the lesser of 2 evils. But the fact still remains, temperatures aren't great. If they had redesigned the cooling system as a whole, say with additional heat pipes over the VRMs and bigger intake vents, we could see cooler component temperatures, which in turn means that you could either reduce fan noise or use more powerful components such as the 115 watt version of the RTX 2060. And that brings me on to the SKUs themselves. This laptop has many options from different CPUs, GPUs, batteries, and storage capacities. Unfortunately, we can't configure each component to make our ideal laptop, unlike say Lenovo who let you do that, but rather we're locked to sometimes questionable combinations of parts. For example, here in Hong Kong we only have models with the 48 watt-hour battery. Why, ASUS? I know tons of people who need all-day battery from their laptop, and the fact that we can't get that here will put off a lot of people who need a powerful laptop that they can also bring to places without a charger. Another questionable part that we're stuck with in Hong Kong is this, the single-channel RAM. This can reduce performance significantly by double-digit percentages, which means that some of those benchmarks I showed you earlier would actually be better had this been fitted with dual-channel RAM. Yet ASUS stuck with single-channel RAM anyway, even though there are 2 RAM slots available, and that 2 8GB sticks of RAM barely cost more than one 16GB stick. I understand that this is a budget laptop, but if ASUS wanted to do some cost cutting, they could at least do it with something else that doesn't impact performance to that extent. Maybe by using a SATA SSD instead of an NVMe, which would feel basically identical anyway. But no. Someone who ends up with a model with single-channel RAM would need to deal with the fact that these powerful components are being held back by something so trivial. And speaking of power, a big selling point of this laptop is that it offers plenty of power for the money, which is enticing for a lot of people such as content creators, myself included. But again, this laptop is plagued by its questionable part combinations. Every model I've seen in Hong Kong, Amazon, Newegg, on pretty much every online review has this 45% NTSC panel, which is not good enough for serious content creation, which sucks because, screen aside, this would be a stellar laptop for that purpose. But that's not the end of it. Oh no. Because believe it or not, there is actually an option for a 144Hz IPS panel with 72% NTSC or 99% sRGB, which is good enough for content creation. It's sad that we can't configure this laptop the way we want, because if we could, this laptop might be appealing to even more people. So with all that in mind, who is this laptop for? Well, if you need a laptop for serious content creation, then unless you somehow manage to find a model with the 99% sRGB screen, I find it tough to recommend for that. Maybe if you get an external monitor with good enough color, then you could get away with using this for content creation, but then again, something like that isn't cheap, and for the additional cash, you might be able to afford a laptop that's just as powerful as this, but with a better screen. If you want something for work, then this would be a great choice actually. It has a good keyboard and trackpad, excellent I/O, and its multitasking prowess is beyond anything in its price class. But I try and get a 90 watt-hour model for that all-day battery and portability. And finally, we have the gamer. I'd give this a recommendation for that too. You have a fluid 144Hz refresh rate and the hardware capable of playing games near that refresh rate. The 2060 can run even the most demanding games at high detail or better with at least 60 FPS and lighter titles closer to 100, even with the single channel RAM on my model. At $1,200 US, this is one of the cheapest 2060 laptops out there, let alone one with this much CPU power, though the 1660 Ti model may offer better value. It's about $200 US cheaper, while the 1660 Ti itself is only 10% slower, though you do lose half your storage. The display's ghosting shouldn't be bothersome for casual gamers, but for the more competitive of you, you might be better looking elsewhere. And it seems like that's the crux of this laptop. There are a lot of things that the A15 has going for it, but at the same time, many small things that hold it back. And much of those could be addressed if we could configure this laptop our own way. Still, for the price, I think it's a good laptop for productivity or gaming. But it could have been an amazing all-rounder. Thanks for watching, guys. If you liked this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Please also remember to hit that bell icon next to it so you don't miss any future videos. Links to buy the TUF A15 will be available in the video description below. Post your questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, and suggestions down in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.